I'm the Principal Engineer Manager for PowerShell. I also own Windows PowerShell, PS Script Analyzer, Editor Services. And this topic perfectly follows the end of Bruce's topic, but unfortunately I have to follow Bruce. I think he gave a great presentation. Yes. So I got my own sad Joey meme here. And the purpose of this topic is really, you started playing with PowerShell Core 6, hopefully, and now I'm going to talk more about PowerShell Core 6.1 and what's coming. So if I can get a quick show of hands, like how many people have actually used PowerShell Core 6? And how many people use it on a regular basis? Awesome, awesome. And how many people have tried 6.1 Preview 1 already? Well, that's actually a little bit surprising for me, which is awesome. So for this talk, I'm going to cover the PowerShell Core 6.1 roadmap. I'm going to talk about some of the new investments that we're making. I have some demos kind of sprinkled throughout the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about PowerShell Standard, which you've already heard before from like Joey and whatnot. I think it's a very important development, and it's something that we're doing in the PowerShell 6.1 timeframe. I'm going to give some thoughts on what I think may end up doing post 6.1. So first, one of the changes that we're doing in the PowerShell Core 6.1 is we're taking a dependency on .NET Core 2.1. So PowerShell Core 6.0 took a dependency on .NET Core 2.0. One of the reasons that we need to take a dependency on 2.1 is that if you saw all the great demos on like Raspberry Pi and, well, we don't have any demos on Windows 10 IoT, but it was also supported as well. .NET Core 2.1 is supposed to take support for ARM processors out of experimental to supported. So that's why we need to take a dependency on 2.1, in addition to all the other improvements I've made in terms of performance, new APIs, and things like that. We want to continue having approximately new preview releases every 3 weeks. We haven't been really great on that since 6.0, primarily because we've had 2 servicing releases for 6.0, and I only have a fixed set of engineers on the team, and they handle everything. So I expect that we'll probably have the preview 2 of 6.1 probably towards the end of next week after myself and Dombo and others get back to Redmond. And currently we're targeting having a general availability, which is like the final supported release of 6.1 unless we have servicing releases towards early July. And again, because we're taking dependency on .NET Core 2.1, if they slip, then we'll slip with them. And in general, we should have new minor releases every 6 months. So that means that early January, we'll probably have a 6.2 release, and next July, 6.3, 6.4, 6.5. And currently, for myself, I'm trying not to ever have a 7 release, because that would, following semantic versioning, that means that it'd be a breaking change. And we're really trying to minimize having breaking changes, although, yes, we do make mistakes. So first, I just really want to thank the community. I don't know if everyone realizes this, but with the PowerShell Core 6.1 Preview 1 release, that included a large number of changes. There was 129 pull requests. So each pull request is a change either to documentation on the repo, some test changes, but a lot of times they're like code changes to the product. And 68 of those PRs actually came from the community. That's more than half of them for the Preview 1 release. And part of that's because the team was busy with the servicing releases. But I also want to call out, so all the names on here, or rather the GitHub usernames, are people that had a PR in the Preview 1 release. So you can see like it's a wide variety of people. I have 3 people highlighted. Mark Krause, Chris Bergmeister, who's here, gave a great presentation on Script Analyzer, and Ilya Sazonov. Those 3 individuals had 10 or more PRs just for this release. So between the 3 of them, they actually had more than half of the community PRs. So I think that's pretty amazing. Now, in addition to doing a lot of feature work, when we released the 6.0 GA, that was back in January 10th, we actually incurred some engineering debt, meaning that we did a bunch of things suboptimally, like we had manual release process, we had to kick off test passes manually, there's a bunch of stuff, even though we're the PowerShell automation team, we still had a lot of manual stuff because it was a trade-off decision. So we're trying to fix that now by automating, using PowerShell, a lot of our release processes. This includes like signing, building, packaging, all this stuff. Trying to get nightly runs of all of our tests. So one thing that Bruce mentioned is that we were not able to take all of the something like 300,000 test cases we had in Windows, to open source for various reasons. Like a lot of them were redundant, they weren't well written, and they relied on a lot of internal Windows knowledge, Windows infrastructure knowledge. So we have, I think, roughly around 7,000 tests now, but we don't run all of them on every supported platform every night. We run on like one SKU of Windows, we run on one distro of Linux and Mac OS, and we really want to run those on all the supported platforms on a regular basis, rather than having my team run them when we do a release. Another big change that we did is we moved from a private fork of Pester 3, because it was not cross-platform, and we had to make some custom changes to make it work on non-Windows. So we moved to Pester 4, which is awesome. Now we're with everyone else, but that also means that we had to do a bunch of changes because there were some breaking changes in Pester for the better. Another big change that we're currently still working through that you haven't seen yet is enabling servicing of PowerShell Core 6 through Microsoft Update. So what that means is that hopefully if we have a PowerShell Core 6.03 servicing release, you would get it through Microsoft Update. So you wouldn't have to go to GitHub and download it. You would just get a notification, assuming that you opted into Microsoft Update, and you would get it that way. So again, we're only taking major bug fixes, blocking fixes, and security fixes in the servicing release for 6.0. And finally, I have a whole bunch of hyperlinks. I think you'll get copies of these decks. This actually links to a RFC that Joey authored, and we're trying to move to a easier model for both servicing and for you guys, which is to have like 2 channels. The way to think about it is you can have, so PowerShell Core 6 and all versions of PowerShell Core 6 are side by side. So you can run 6.0, 6.01, 6.02. But for most people, they'll probably want to have a stable 6.0, which would be 6.02 release right now, and also be able to play with the latest greatest 6.1. So you would have a stable servicing install, and then you'd have a preview install, and those would be treated effectively as 2 different products, and then we would update each one independently. And this will work on both Windows and non-Windows. Now, in terms of new investments or new features that you guys might actually impact you guys, done by the PowerShell team specifically, we'll of course continue to address issues reported on GitHub. One thing I want to call out, and if you go to this link on here, basically, if an issue on GitHub has a milestone 610 consider, those are the issues that either myself or some team member have looked at and said, yeah, this is something that we should definitely have or try to have for 6.1. It doesn't guarantee that we'll have it in 6.1, but it means that we'll look at it, we'll investigate it, we'll determine the complexity of the fix if the problem is understood and all that. But it also means that if an issue you open doesn't have that milestone, it means that we're not considering to spend time on it because we have a limited amount of time between now, the end of April, to early July. So what that means is if you have an issue that is not marked 6.1 consider, just mention me if you think it's something that we should consider for 6.1. Now, even if it doesn't get fixed in 6.1, guess what? We're on this faster cadence. You can get it in 6.2 or potentially 6.3 or whatever, so it shouldn't be as big a deal as it used to be. So one of the new features that we're going to develop, but I don't have a demo because I don't think there's any code yet for this yet, there's an RFC, is experimental feature flags. So the idea here is that in the future, once we have this in place, if we have features that would span multiple minor releases, because it takes time to bake something, and once we call it stable, it becomes a breaking change if we change anything, or at least breaking changes. So what this would enable you to do is enumerate all the features. This would be opt-in, so you can enumerate, here's all the features in the latest release. They're experimental. You can try them out, give us the feedback. It's easier for you to give us feedback probably in code than in a spec. And so once we get enough feedback, then we can make it non-experimental. We're also making some big changes in the help system. I'm going to show a demo for 2 of these things. One is markdown rendering. So for those of you who have kind of played with our repository, you see like a lot of our documentation is in markdown. It's like the new hotness kind of thing. Basically, it's text without having markup, so it's not like XML or anything like that. And I'll talk more about that when I get to the demo. We also refactored the help system as a separate module. So the code today for the help system is entirely part of the engine, which to me didn't make a lot of sense. And I'll talk more about why later on in this presentation, why we would do that. And finally, updatable help per user is something that impacted me personally because I always had to like elevate or sudo to update help, which is a big pain point. So let me just show the first demo here. Hopefully you can see this. The hard-to-read text basically says that I'm using a private build off a fork because this isn't checked in yet. It's still work in progress. This is the this is actually the Markdown rendering demo. So in what I'm doing here is showing that there's a couple of new commands that will be introduced, and we're still working through the user experience. So don't think this is final. If you have opinions about this, just add it to the RFC. What I'm doing here is I am going to just show the current representation of what help looks like. So if you went to like Sergey's presentation on Platypus, then you know that we currently have all our help documentation in Markdown, and then we convert it to MAML as part of updatable help. The idea is just keep it in Markdown. There's no reason to translate it back to MAML. So using the commandlet here, what I can do then is actually have a much prettier presentation at the console. We'll do some work with some of the colors, which is a little bit hard to read right now. But again, this is an early prototype, and I expect that we'll probably make the colors and all that configurable. But the idea is that if you use your imagination, it's going to be easier to consume this because now headers are, they stand out and stuff like that. Similarly, if you just have any arbitrary Markdown file, using this open source library MarkDig, you can actually render it as HTML. So this will look the same as if you visit our GitHub repo. And this is just the README, and this is all rendered through the commandlet. All right, this is a much shorter demo, but again, I think a lot of you will hopefully appreciate this. I'm sure everyone here knows, like today, if you try to update help, you have to be elevated or you have to run sudo on Linux or Mac because the help files are in the system, the machine installation of PowerShell. So here again, I expect this to probably show up in preview 2. But here I can do a update without needing to be elevated. So here, the first thing I'll do is just show, I don't have the updatable help. It's just get the basic syntax help using get help on git command. And here I'm going to do the update help. And again, you're going to have to trust me, but this user in the shell is not elevated. And now if I do get help, I'll get the full help. So that means that, again, people don't have to run as admin when they don't need to run as admin. All right, some more new investments? Sure. The Markdown? Oh, so one thing I didn't mention, right now the scope of the RFC doesn't touch the inline help. However, there is a part of the RFC that talks about the ability for any either script author or module author that if you have a string that you want to tag as a Markdown, it can go through our rendering system. So you can leverage that. I think that's a good suggestion. Maybe you can add a comment to the RFC. So one of the things that we unfortunately didn't do as part of the PowerShell Core 6.0 GA release was have parity with Windows PowerShell in terms of device guard and app blocker integration. And so basically what this means is if you are using device guard and app blocker on a lockdown system, basically, unfortunately, I have to say don't use PowerShell Core 6. And the reason for that is because PowerShell Core 6 is signed by Microsoft, it's going to be trusted by device guard and app blocker. And once you start PowerShell Core 6, then you pretty much can run whatever you want. So we already have a pull request, I think that was merged recently, so hopefully this will show up in preview 2, where we actually are a proper citizen on those type of systems. One of the things that Bruce talked about in terms of workflow, which is not necessarily the same thing here, which is getting better, easier at doing concurrency. So in this case, it's really, can we make it easier to do threading for script authors? So if you're a developer today, you can use the runspace API. Each of those runspace can run a separate thread, or you can just use the .NET threading APIs. But for script people, that's a little bit more complicated. So we're considering, and we have an RFC published for this as well, I think, on considering 2 options right now, and maybe there's other options we should consider. One is called Thread Job. This is a module that one of the engineers on my team wrote, and I find this a little bit more interesting because it conforms to all of the PowerShell job semantics. And the reason for that is the engineer who wrote this also did a lot of work for PowerShell jobs, so there's a natural relationship there. The other one that we're going to evaluate is PowerShell job, which I know is kind of popular in the community. I also know there's some feedback of whether or not it's the right thing to stay with one solution versus letting innovation happen in the community. So we'll have those debates in the committee. But let me just show you this one first. So this module is already published to the gallery. It also works in Windows PowerShell, so you can use it in either 5, probably even older versions. But here, I'm installing the module, and I'm going to show, I guess, that I have the module installed, but then I'm going to show the sample test script that I have. The script is pretty simple. Basically, I want to show that one of the big benefits of using thread job versus just a regular PowerShell job is performance. And here I'm just going to start out 10 jobs. Each of those jobs is going to get the PS version table, and I'm going to wait on all the jobs until all of them finish. And this has already been kicked off, and soon it's going to finish, but it's going to take just under 15 seconds to do all that. And with a thread job, it's almost immediate, right? Less than a second. And really the big difference here is really all the initialization of starting a Windows process, all the initialization of starting a PowerShell run space and all that stuff. Now, of course, thread jobs is not necessarily appropriate for everything you want to do. If you need process isolation, then you should continue to use regular PowerShell jobs to start a new process. But again, that module is already published. You can start using it today. Give us feedback. Jason Shurk had published PS Reline 2.0 beta around the time that I think we GA'd. I'm committed to using some of my team resources to help him bring that out of beta to a proper GA quality release so that we can ship it as part of PowerShell Core 6.1. The one that's striked out is something we cut from 6.1. So if you've participated in some of the community calls, which we have, I think, the third Thursday or something every month, except for this one because we're here. Also, if you read my blog about PowerShell 6.1 roadmap way back when, I talked about machine learning, stuff like that. So just to give some context, this all kind of started with two different things. One is, how can we improve the interactive experience and make IntelliSense and autocomplete smarter? And the second is, some of the engineers on my team just had an interest in machine learning, so I figured why not kind of have those two things together, give them an opportunity to explore some new stuff and provide value to the end user. As it turns out, based on some of the community feedback and based on our own investigation, this is a much bigger piece of work than what we can actually do in this time frame. And from a priority perspective, it makes sense to cut it. So this is not like cut forever, but I'll talk more about it in the future. I do want to kind of bring back some elements of it in the future. If you saw Joey's presentation on PowerShell Core 6.0 and OpenSSH, I'm a firm believer, even though Bruce is correct that I was there at the beginning of WinRM creation and WSPAN protocol creation. I think those are legacy technologies. And I think SSH is really the future for management remoting protocol. So we've been doing a bunch of stuff to make that even better with PowerShell Core 6. So let me just give a quick demo on two small improvements that were made, and these should show up, I believe, in Preview 2. So for those of you who use SSH on a regular basis, the first demo here is just going to be, if you're like me, and to be honest, I was the one who made this change because I was kind of getting tired of typing the same stuff over. If you use enter PS session today, you do hostname, and then you have to use username as a separate parameter. But if you use ssh.exe, you can provide both of those at the same time. So this is basically allowing you to provide enter PS session -hostname, because hostname is one of the parameters that tell you that we're using the SSH parameter set. But you can now say enter PS session hostname Steve at the IP address, once this demo catches up to me. And so that's a very simple, but it's also a very consistent experience for people already familiar with SSH. And that's what I'm trying to provide here. And again, you may notice that I'm not getting prompted for any passwords because I'm using public key authentication. Although you could argue that maybe I should have a password on the key, but it is to a local VM. The other change here is that if you follow the documentation that we have on how to configure PowerShell remoting over SSH, you have to modify SSHD config. You create a new subsystem called PowerShell. You point it to your version of PWSH that you want to use. The main problem there is you're tied to just one version of PowerShell and one set of command line arguments sent to PWSH. So if you wanted to have side by side with like 6.1, previews or like the preview channel, and also go with the stable channel, you can't do that with the preview one we say have today. So this change here is really allowing you to provide the subsystem as an argument. So that means that you can actually define multiple subsystems in your SSHD config, and we would send that parameter. So now you can have different versions of PWSH. You could have the same version of PWSH with different arguments. And this basically shows, yeah, I created 2 sessions. One of them targeted 6.1 preview 1, and the other one targeted 6.02. The last part here is just a minor change that I had remembered, and I think this is already in preview 1, which is we added a transport property to PS session. So if you're using different transports to manage your enterprise, like using WSMan, using PowerShell Direct, which currently, unfortunately, doesn't work correctly with PowerShell Core 6 because it's hard-coded to PowerShell.exe, which will eventually get fixed. But basically, this will tell you which transport you have for each computer that you connect it to. So it's a small thing. I believe Jeffrey gave a demo that's related to this, which is, one of the feedback that we have, one of the big challenges that we have is, hey, PowerShell Core 6, pretty awesome, it's fast, it's got a bunch of new capabilities, but you don't have the coverage, right? Because a lot of the existing Windows PowerShell modules, unfortunately, don't work for various reasons. So one of the things that we decided when we had the 6.0 GA release is we can't just simply allow you to enumerate the Windows modules on your system because we don't know if they're going to work or not. So what we have is we're going to provide this Windows PowerShell Compatibility Pack module. If you go to this URL, then basically right now you'll just find a README. I'm hoping to have a preview release that includes like the R module that was demoed that Bruce is writing, as well as encapsulating the Windows PS module path module, which I'm going to demo soon, as well as adding the Windows Compatibility Pack for .NET Core. That's not a PowerShell thing, but basically what that does is it adds a whole ton of additional APIs that are not part of Core Framework. So you'll get back stuff like ADSI, you'll get the old WMI APIs back actually. So my plan is actually to have a preview of that hopefully in May. And then the last, so our module is about how to call PowerShell, Windows PowerShell modules from PowerShell Core 6 via implicit remoting. And the last part is, we had some controversy when we removed some of the aliases, and then we removed some aliases later again. The consideration here is maybe have a command that just adds back all the existing Windows PowerShell aliases so that at least existing scripts will continue to work. I don't know if that's going to be a good idea or a bad idea, but it'll be opt-in anyways. So let me just do a quick demo on this module, which is, again, this is already published on the PowerShell gallery. You can try it today. So here I have to remote into a Windows box, of course, because this only works on Windows, or it's only relevant to Windows anyways. Here I'm using Windows 10. I'm going to install the module. And again, you can use this against PowerShell Core 6 or 6.1. And I'm going to install this to my current user. And the basic idea here is that it has one commandlet, which is called add Windows PS module path. And what it does is it will actually go out to your system, get the current Windows PS module path as defined on that system. So if you have applications installed that modified it, you'll get all that. And it will add it to that current session. So if you want this to persist, then you can, the best thing to do is probably just add it to your profile under PowerShell Core 6. But if you need to run it every time if you want it every time. So the basic idea here is that once you run the add Windows PS module path commandlet and you get that added, now you have access to all of the Windows modules within PowerShell Core 6. Again, this does not mean those modules will work. But it does mean that you can try them to see if they work. And there's an issue on GitHub that was using to kind of track stuff that people have tried. Me and Joe are working with Windows teams to get them to start validating their stuff and rebuilding their stuff on PowerShell Standard, which I'll talk later. So hopefully over time, this whole thing is not necessary. But there may be other modules that you've gotten that the author is not updating anymore, and you may still need some of this capability. I will say that all the cdxml commands should just work, and that's a large portion of all the commands in Windows. So this is just showing that I can run, and I believe this is a cdxml command that you would not be able to use in PowerShell Core 6 without running this module to import or add the Windows PS module path. All right, so let me talk a bit about some additional new investments. So Alpine Linux. Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room know what Alpine Linux is? Oh, yeah, I see one hand, two, a small handful. So the interesting thing about Alpine Linux and why a lot of people care about Alpine is that it seems to be the predominant choice to use in Docker containers. And the reason is that it's small and lightweight. One of the big differences between Alpine and other distros like CentOS, Fedora, Ubuntu is that it's actually compiled using a different libc library. So this is like the native code. It's using a library called Muscle. instead of a new libc. And basically, that means all native binaries are not compatible unless you recompile with muscle. So this is actually an interesting story in that there was a lot of asks on the GitHub repo to say, hey, can you provide an Alpine Linux supported version of PowerShell? And it was a hard problem because .NET Core itself didn't support it. With the 2.1 release, they started adding support. I'm not sure if they're going to move out of experimental by the time they release. But basically, they were able to recompile .NET Core, which has a lot of native code, using muscle. And with that, I was working with a community member, Casper3. I don't know his real name. I don't know if he's in this room. Raise your hand if you're Casper3. I want to shake your hand. But basically, working with him on GitHub was a great experience because between the two of us, we were able to produce a bash script to compile PowerShell, both the native components and the managed components, and get it running in a Docker container with Alpine Linux. So that was completely necessary because all of our tool chain to produce PowerShell today depends on PowerShell. So like the build PSM1 and all that stuff, it expects that you already have a version of PowerShell running. So the idea is that with this bash script, we can bootstrap it, get a version of PowerShell running. That way we can update all the other tool chain and produce actual versions. Unfortunately, I found out, I think earlier this week, that I'm actually not able to build off our current master and Alpine version because of some incompatibilities with .NET Core. So that means that we're definitely not going to get a Alpine Linux build for Preview 2, but hopefully we'll get it for Preview 3. I'm going to skip the PowerShell IT for now because I have a demo for that. I want to talk about Snapcraft a little bit. So on Linux, one of the problems you have is you got all these distros, and all of them have different layouts on the file system in terms of libraries, different versions of libraries. So that's why today we do have a couple of different builds of PowerShell for different Linux distros. We have this one build, which I think currently still doesn't work, called AppImage, which solves some of this problem. And basically what AppImage does is kind of like a container technology that kind of takes all your dependencies, all the native Linux libraries that you need, and packages it up so that you're actually using the ones in the package versus what's on the system. So we've been working with Canonical, who owns this technology called Snapcraft, which is kind of very similar to AppImage. And the idea that they have is very similar, where you can produce a single snap package, and it'll be working across all the Linux distros, all the popular distros that they support. So this is, even though it's by Canonical, is not limited to Ubuntu. It'll work on Red Hat, Fedora, CentOS, I think even OpenSUSE's there. There's a whole bunch of, you can go to the Snapcraft website and see it. We're still working through some of I'll just say the legal challenges of producing a snap because Snapcraft code is based on GPL. But hopefully, again, not for Preview 2, but probably maybe Preview 3 will have a snap package available, which means that you can go to the Canonical Snap store, and for at least your Linux distro that you care about that supports Snappy, which is the tool to install it, you know, you gotta love these open source names, you can install this package and you don't have to worry about going to GitHub. You can also get updates via the Snap store as well, so that kind of solves the equivalent Microsoft update problem. So let me do a quick demo. These will definitely not be as cool as the IoT demos that were at the lunch break, if you saw those. Partly because I don't have my Raspberry Pi physically here. I thought it'd be easier because I didn't trust the Wi-Fi network to record all my demos. But basically here I'm just going to do a regular SSH into a Pi that I happen to have in my office back in Redmond. And again, as was mentioned at the lunch break, you have to run pwsh under sudo because it needs to access hardware, and it requires root access. So this is, it's going to take a little bit longer because on ARM currently we don't have cross-gen support, which is basically a tool from .NET CLI that allows you to compile the intermediate language code into native code. So it affects startup. So basically on startup, if you don't have native code and you have intermediate language, it has to do all that compilation at startup time. Here I'm just kind of proving that I'm running Raspbian Stretch, which is currently the only Linux distro we support on Raspberry Pi 3. And then I'm going to show that I have the PowerShell IoT module, which we made public last week, I think, or early this week. I think it was last week. And the idea here is that we really want to kind of just help bootstrap the community. The plan is not for my team to develop all the capabilities that we would want in a PowerShell IoT module, but really get everything started. You guys build some awesome stuff. Please submit it as PRs to the PowerShell IoT module so we can start building together an Uber module so that people can use it to do IoT type of stuff. In this particular case, I'm using one of the examples from the PowerShell IoT repository to talk to a BME280 device, which is basically a temperature sensor. In this case, I happen to know that the ID is a hex 76 because of the way I have it connected to my Raspberry Pi. But here I'm using this other commandlet to basically get the temperature, and this is all in Celsius, and I also have it in Fahrenheit for me because I don't know Celsius. But it's a little bit warm because my Pi sits on top of another machine. But basically the idea here is we want to use PowerShell to provide the abstraction layer over hardware, so that for those of you who want to do automation of IoT, you just worry about your business logic, not worry so much about interfacing directly with the hardware. Module authors will have to worry about that. All right, so let me talk a bit about PowerShell Standard Library. I know that I think Jeffrey might have touched on this. I know Joey definitely did. So the big thing here is we're doing this, the PowerShell Standard Library version 5.1. We currently have, I think, at least preview 3, maybe preview 4 already published. And this is going to be GA ideally in the PowerShell Core 6.1 timeframe. So what this is an ability for module authors to make their modules compatible across different versions of PowerShell. So specifically Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core. And also, because of some of the decisions we made, it makes it, it's not a guarantee, but it makes it more ensure that your module is also cross-platform compatible. And I'll explain some of that later on here. And what it is really a subset of all the APIs that we expose in System Management Automation Assembly. So, to simplify it, if you're a module author today, what you would do is instead of targeting a specific .NET Framework or .NET Core, you would target Net Standard 2.0, and then you would actually reference PowerShell Standard Library instead of SMA. So I have some diagrams here to kind of give you a visual representation, hopefully a better understanding of what PowerShell Standard actually is. So this red box represents all the APIs that are public, that are exposed through System Management Automation DL in Windows PowerShell 5.1. All right, so it's just a red box. This overlapping box, this blue box, is all the public APIs that we expose in System Management Automation in PowerShell Core 6. I don't know if you can see it well on the screen, but these, one is not a subset of the other. There's overlap, right? A significant overlap. But in PowerShell Core 6, we added a bunch of new APIs. We took pull requests from the community that ended up adding a bunch of new APIs. We also had explicit decisions to deprecate some things, which I'll talk more about next, but I think Bruce covered some of this as well. And what PowerShell Standard Library v5.1 is really a subset of the overlap. And I'll explain it in the next slide why it's a subset and not just the entirety of the overlap here. So we decided early on when we did the first preview of PowerShell Standard v3, and just so you know, the versions of the PowerShell Standard libraries did not start with 1. They explicitly align with PowerShell versions. So what that means is that if you build against PowerShell Standard v3, your module will work with Windows PowerShell 3, Windows PowerShell 4, Windows PowerShell 5, 5.1, and PowerShell Core 6, and future versions as well. If you build with version PowerShell Standard 5.1, then of course that is not going to work with, it may not work with 5, but it definitely won't work with 4, 3, 2, and 1, and stuff like that. But we made some specific decisions where, for example, snap-ins is completely gone out of PowerShell Core, almost completely gone out of PowerShell Core 6. Public snap-ins, anyways, is not there. We still have some internal code that's snap-in based. We do want people to build modules, not snap-ins. Workflow's not there, transactions not there. There's a bunch of legacy APIs, so this was an opportunity for us to really remove some of the legacy APIs because it was somewhat redundant with new APIs that were improved. And it just causes confusion to have those two sets of APIs. And going back to the cross-platform, there's some specific code that is still in PowerShell Core 6 that is not cross-platform compatible, like SIM support. So there's a bunch of code in there for like the CDXML stuff that's just not cross-platform compatible, and there's currently no plans to make it cross-platform compatible. So we explicitly excluded that so that if you build against this, then it's a higher probability that it will be cross-platform compatible unless you call some Windows APIs or something like that, or you call them Linux APIs. One thing I ask is if, for the developers in the room who are trying this out, if you do find issues, and we do have issues because a lot of this work was manual. Jim Truer is the one who kind of built a bunch of tooling to generate all the API stubs and build the actual assembly. If you find issues, please open them on the PowerShell Standard repo, not the PowerShell repo. And Jim's pretty good at reacting to that and getting new versions out. And you can actually get the published versions just off of NuGet.org. All right, so let's talk about some more exciting stuff or potential stuff, future stuff. So again, I want to kind of reiterate one of the things that Jeffrey said at his keynote is, I and I don't think anyone on my team know exactly what future versions of PowerShell look like, because half the contributions are coming from the community. So the community is also driving the direction of PowerShell Core 6.x. At the same time that myself and Joey and my team is driving some direction that we want for business reasons. I'm going to skip going to the dashboard. I showed that earlier, or in the past before. But you can go to the dashboard. It shows you like a bunch of information about the top contributors, the PRs coming from the community versus Microsoft. The thing I want to call out here is if you're not able to like submit code or issues or whatnot, one thing that will still definitely help us is if you see an issue that you care about, or you see an RFC that you think should be implemented, just use the GitHub thumbs up feature. If you want, you can also use the thumbs down feature if you disagree with it. But this is data that will really help us prioritize our work. Because if we don't have this, then we just kind of have to go with kind of like the last comment I heard from somebody from the community. And that's not a good way to go. So I prefer getting some more data here, and it's a very easy way to give us data. Just use the thumbs up, thumbs down. Even better if you can provide a comment. Now, for myself, and again, the next set of slides is really speaking for myself. It doesn't mean like these are things I say will happen. As these things I want to at least investigate whether or not we can do it within a 6.2 or future time frame. So ubiquity. So I think the way to really kind of drive PowerShell Core 6 adoption is just to make it there, right? Like you would use it if you're managing some systems and it just was on that system. So part of it is really, for example, Azure Functions, Azure Automation today, like some awesome services, but they only provide Windows PowerShell 5.1. We need to work with those teams to make sure that you can have PowerShell Core 6 as an option. We also want to, like, this is more of a dream, I guess, because there's a lot of partner work that make this happen, because Microsoft in Azure doesn't own all the VM images in Azure. But ideally, you create a new Azure VM, and guess what? PowerShell Core 6 is just there. Or you create a new container, and it's just there. That way, you don't have to think about deploying it. Minimally, I want to look at ways to make it easier to deploy it into a VM or container if we can't solve the problem of having it there by default. Is there a question? Okay. Bruce kind of talked about this as well. We did a bunch of classes work previously, primarily focused on enabling authoring DSC resources without having to author them off. I think that was a great success, but it also means that we had very limited use outside of DSC, at least for peer programming needs. So definitely we want to visit some of that. And again, there's a couple of issues already on the repo that talk about different suggestions, like the property setters and getters, interfaces, I think, is another one. So again, use a thumbs up and thumbs down to help us prioritize, because I don't know if I can have our engineers do all that work, but it'll help us tell what is important to you. DSL, again, there's something that's kind of been mentioned around domain-specific language. For example, if you use Pester, that's a DSL, but Pester had to do some tricks, and if you write Pester tests, which you should, you know that you have to have the open brace on the same line, because it's really masquerading as the DSL when it's actually a function. So having actual DSL support means that you can actually do stuff like DC configuration type of syntax, where you can have braces wherever you want, and we won't necessarily have to have a debate here about where the brace should be. GUIs. So I kind of talked about this in one of the community calls. Like, I would love to have more GUI support. Like, some people really miss OutGrid View. Like, you saw a couple of the demos. People are using OutGrid View. It's a great way to visualize an object. And I was working with Jim Truer on some of the console rendering and trying to basically enable having the equivalent of OutGrid View. So now, whether you're in Cloud Shell or you're doing like a SSH session or just in a basic terminal, you can still do OutGrid View. You can still sort your object, you can filter. You can hopefully do like a show script, so show you like, here's the equivalent PowerShell script to do it if you want to like, fan it out to multiple machines. But the idea here is really take that one step higher and say, hey, can we have an abstraction layer for anyone who wants to define a GUI, and whether it's OutGrid View or some custom GUI, and have renderers, right? So that we can now render that abstraction in the console, render as HTML, and if you're in VS Code, we can leverage some of the VS Code GUI elements so you can get a nice representation there. This is probably something that will span multiple minor releases. It's not a small project. Going back to when I talk about machine learning, so for me, one of the motivations of that was really to improve IntelliSense and autocomplete. Like, I kind of like, if you go to Bing or Google, you start typing, it kind of tries to predict what you're trying to type. For me, as a user of PowerShell, like most of the time when I'm in PowerShell, I'm actually doing git kind of commands. So when I type G, I would like it to just complete git and assume I'm going to do the rest of it. And if I keep typing, it will keep returning to prediction. I think that what we want is to actually provide two things. One is an extensibility mechanism, so we can plug in and anyone else can plug in. So if you guys had thoughts on how to make that better, you guys can actually write plugins and improve some of the intelligence and type complete. But also maybe focus a little bit more on the local stuff rather than machine learning, so you don't have to send stuff to the cloud. I think that was one of the big feedback from the community. So Jeffrey talked a bit about, I think he called it programming at large. So really, Azure Stack, I worked with their team on some of the troubles they had. They have something like 250,000 lines of code of PowerShell and DSC. It's a huge project, a lot of complexity. They hit a lot of issues in terms of like debuggability. It's hard when you're targeting like multiple machines. On all those machines, you're creating new run spaces and something fails. How do you actually debug that? It's just really hard today. So we're looking at some debugging and logging improvements to make that easier. So whether it's Azure Stack themselves or you're doing some complex deployment in the cloud or some management in the cloud, we're going to remoting to multiple machines, we should have a much better debugging experience there. At the same time, one of the things I want to look at is really how to have a separation of a different package for PowerShell where you have a full, what I'll call like a full developer package. You get like the full interactive experience. You get a whole ton of modules part of it. Everything that you need to develop PowerShell scripts or develop PowerShell modules. And then for the stuff that you have in a container or in a VM where you just want to manage it, like you just want to send scripts to it and have it run, you don't need all of the other stuff that comes with PowerShell today. You don't need like the help system. You don't need a lot of the interactive components. I want to make it much smaller. Of course, making it smaller isn't just about like disk footprint, but you also use less memory, less CPU, and it's also a smaller attack surface. So there's a bunch of refactoring work that we'd have to do to make this possible. Just general performance improvements, of course. For security, I had some deep discussions with Lee Holmes on this. I think these are like the two top areas that I want to kind of look into in the 6.2 timeframe. Script injection is a real problem. So a lot of people, when they write their scripts or modules, they don't necessarily validate all the input. Maybe they're using an environmental variable to construct a path, and someone can just, guess what, override that environmental variable before they call you, and now you're maybe executing something you don't know. So the idea is really for all input that's coming outside of like the script or module scope, we should be able to track that and do some additional validation. If we know that this is supposed to be a path, we can check that it's a path before we pass it to you, kind of thing. Going back to device guard, so even with the work that we're doing in 6.1 to integrate back into device guard and app locker, it doesn't support audit mode. So for those of you who played with like device guard, the idea with audit mode is you may not know ahead of time what the rules are on what you need to run. So you want to set it to audit to see what people do, and then you can now review all the audit events to see, hey, they should and shouldn't be doing this. So we would like PowerShell to participate in that, so we can actually generate audit events so that the IT pro can say, hey, after looking at this audit, I can maybe lock it down to just this core set of commands or executables. As I also own editor services and VSCode, I have a couple of thoughts here. Again, we will always continue to address customer issues. We don't have a formal release cycle that we have for PowerShell Core. It actually releases fairly frequently and irregularly whenever we have sufficient value. One of the things I would like to look at is really how to have better integration with Azure Functions and Azure Automation. So for those of you who use Azure Automation, Azure Functions today, for me, I use it to build like the PowerShell dashboard, Power BI dashboard. It's a little bit not fun because basically you're either authoring or pasting a script into a web editor, and then when you're debugging, at the time, at least when I did it, there was no easy debugging. So basically, I was doing a bunch of write verboses and whatnot to just send output and trying to debug it that way. And it was, for me, it was not a good experience. So what I want to be able to do is actually enable you guys to use VSCode to just authenticate with Azure and be able to do your authoring and debugging in VSCode and actually have it run in the functions and automation environment. We already have, for those who may or may not be aware, we have a Vim integration with editor services. It currently is only being used in CloudShell. The plan is to make that open source. The only sticking point is to find out who's going to maintain it, because you can't just throw code out there, you have to maintain it. And we're looking at, I would like to in the future also have integration with the other popular editors, but I would like to kind of work with the community on that. We can't just have a small set of engineers to maintain all that. And there's general perf and reliability improvements that we need to make in both the VS Code integration side and also editor services. I also want to call out specifically thanks to 3 community maintainers, Keith Hill, Patrick, and David Wilson. I think they've been doing an outstanding job on the editor services VS Code side. So the other somewhat big project I own is Script Analyzer, and if you missed Chris Bergmeister's presentation on that, he provided a lot of thoughts on what he thinks he wants to work on, or the set of people to work on, which I think is great. This is just some stuff which is already kind of in progress already. I don't know if it'll be complete within 6.1. I hope some of it will be. Today, if you wanted to contribute new rules to Script Analyzer, you have to actually do it in C#. We should really enable you to write PowerShell script and maybe even leverage like the DSL work, but then you have to wait for that. So I want to figure out how to make that work. And also having complete rules to help you move your scripts to make them compile across Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core, as well as from Windows to Linux and Mac. So having a good set of rules there to tell you, hey, this won't work if you care, this won't work on Linux, or this won't work in PowerShell Core, and vice versa. And again, Chris is one of, he's not only one of the top contributors to PowerShell Core, he's also a maintainer in PS Script Analyzer and provides a lot of contributions to that repo as well. So it's actually kind of amazing how much he does. All right, to summarize, and I think we're getting back on time. We're good? Okay. I think the key takeaway here is PowerShell Core 6, we update much more frequently than Windows PowerShell ever did, WMF. Those were tied specifically to Windows releases. So minimally it was like a year, and maximally it was like 3 years for release. So to be on board here, you really need to adopt the modern lifecycle, which is fix forward, see it on the latest version. And again, once we have it integrated with Microsoft Update, it should be seamless, and we will, of course, be very vigorous in trying to make sure we don't have breaking changes so that you don't have to worry about that. Again, one of the themes here is, you can leverage your PowerShell skills that you have today in other environments. So if you're primarily Windows today, guess what? You can also look at managing IoT, containers, cloud. We have PowerShell commandlets that work in PowerShell Core 6 from VMware, Google Compute Cloud, AWS, and of course Azure. If you're a module author or you think about building a module, or you already have a module, please think about rebuilding it, targeting PowerShell Standard Library. This will give you a much larger addressable market. So people, that may not be looking at it today, maybe Linux people, if it can work on Linux, might find it interesting. Yes?
I've heard multiple people say that, but I have no idea how I code a module against that standard. How do I check it?
How do you check it?
That it follows PowerShell Standard Library.
Okay, so the question is, how do you know, I guess, how to do it? I kind of covered it a bit previously. I think what the takeaway I'm getting is I'll probably have a blog post. I think Jim may have already published one, and maybe we need to publish an updated one that really goes through step by step and probably a much more complicated example than a hello world, and say, hey, you have dependencies on these other assemblies. You want to do stuff on Linux and stuff like that, and we'll have something published. I can't state a date of when that happened. This is like a new thing right now, so. But that's good feedback. And finally, when we have a preview of the Windows PowerShell Compatibility Pack, please use it. Again, I'm personally trying to target a May preview release, and that will help get some feedback on how we can help you guys, if you're not using PowerShell Core 6 on a regular basis, start moving towards that. And if you have any other questions, I'm available. You can raise your hand, or you can find me down there. Yes? Okay, so the question is about like web commandlet improvements. So I actually thought about including that, but to be honest, the reason I include it is all of the investments that we're doing is the stuff that my team is doing, and pretty much Mark Krause is independently doing almost all of the web commandlet improvements. So I decided that I'll leave it to him to maybe have his blog post, and he should get the recognition for that. But yes, there's been a ton of improvements in the web commandlets. In fact, I think that if there's one reason to even look at PowerShell Core 6, it's really for all the improvements in not only the web commands, but the JSON commandlets. Yes?
Do you know
So the question is about SSH being default on Windows. Are you talking about enabling SSH remoting on Windows PowerShell or just having it available?
No, instead of WinRM.
Oh, instead of WinRM? Okay, so the question is replacing WinRM with SSH remoting on Windows. So currently there's no plan to backport that capability to Windows PowerShell. That has come up before in the past. There's a problem today where we actually don't have an ability to produce a new WMF. So even if we did this, you would only get it in a new version of Windows 10 or Windows Server 2016. And that already impacts probably a large set of customers, which is one of the reasons why we decided not to do that. Yeah, it's a difficult problem, even though I keep saying that SSH is the future. Yeah, sorry. Any other questions? Yes, back there. So the question is multi-factor auth. I was going to do a demo here, but I don't have it. So if you're asking about WinRM, there's currently no plans to make any changes to WinRM. In fact, WinRM is basically, I think, it's actually owned by one of my peer teams, but there's no plans to make changes to WinRM. In terms of, if you're using SSH remoting, the great thing about using SSH is it already supports a lot of multi-factor options. One of the things I did on my VMs is I actually set up Google Authenticator so I can actually use both my public key and get a one-time password to actually SSH into one of my boxes. I actually turn it off for my demos because I have to keep picking up my phone. So with PowerShell over SSH remoting, you can leverage the multi-factor auth that SSH already provides today. So you can use Google Authenticator, you can use password with public key, you can use Kerberos with public key. There's a lot of different options. So that's one of the benefits of moving to SSH is we don't have to reinvent all that in WinRM. So I know that Azure PowerShell is doing a bunch of work so that, and I think Alexander, you demoed it on going to a web page, you go there, you authenticate with the web page, and then you get authenticated in your cmdlet module. I don't know if there's any plans to generalize that for other people to use. That might be, like Azure might have their own plans. Yeah. Oh, Joey. All right. There's your answer. Any other questions? Yes.
In Linux, there's a command screen. Is there such a thing in
You're talking about the screen utility?
the command screen?
Yes. So the question is about the screen utility. So there's a great utility on Linux called Screen. And basically what it does is it allows you to park a terminal session there. So for example, one of the capabilities that Bruce talked about in WinRM that doesn't exist in SSH remoting is that you can disconnect and reconnect. In SSH, if you disconnect from your SSH session, that whole thing just goes away. So if you use a screen utility, you can actually create terminals there that you can reconnect to. But the answer to your question is no, there's no utility I'm aware of on the Windows side that does it. There may be a chance that the Windows subsystem for Linux or the console team might do something similar. But I know that there's a gap there that would exist on Windows today if we don't have that capability. But it's not something that, as far as I know, there's no plan by anyone to have that capability there today, which is unfortunate, but it may be in the future. Any other questions? Yes? Is it time? Okay. Last question. Go ahead. So like an editor so your question is, will there ever be an editor just part of PowerShell? Yeah. I think that's something that has come up before. I think once we do like the GUI work, it might be something that we can entertain with a very basic notepad kind of experience, but that's certainly not in any roadmap. I think there's a lot of popular console-based editing tools already, and I don't know if it makes sense for us to compete with that. I know there's a problem where you want it just there by default. So maybe the community can provide something. I think we're out of time, so I want to respect the next speaker, whoever that may be. Thank you.